of production, and kind of trying to look at whether this relationship is always going to be art's full subsumption under capital, or whether this kind of like promiscuity that both of them have would allow art to say something about finance. So that's me.
I'm Joshua Simon. I'm a curator and writer, and I'm just to present what I've been up to recently. I'm coming out of this project, Kids Want Communism, and a book, Being Together Precedes Being, that was around the kind of the potentials of communism. So starting with the 99th anniversary of the Soviet Revolution. And out of this, I'm developing something called the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, where I'm trying to actually learn from a Soviet experience about our times. So to give an example, shock work, which is something that arises with the first 5-year plan, is one of the first attempts to get out of Fordism. And so I try to look at shock work in relation to social media today. So Stakhanov and Kim Kardashian. I mean, Kim Kardashian is an old story, but with this, or Kanye West going to Trump is like Stakhanov going to Stalin, you know, like in the 1930s. I mean, as an event of technology, subjectivity, governance, all those things together. So this is one thing, and the other thing, which I think is more relevant to actually what we're talking about today, is I'm working on something called metastability, and it's a whole thing about how the gesture of contemporary art curating embodies a logic that is the logic of finance, and that is the logic also of the environmental collapse, and is the logic of so many other things. So within this, I'm looking into the relations of the artificial, and I'll elaborate on that in a bit.
Thanks. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I am Kristoffer Gansing, and I work as the artistic director of a festival in Berlin, which is called the Transmediale Festival for Art and Digital Culture. Been doing this for 9 years, and I guess I can bring in a little bit of different kind of ideas and materials from that festival also as we go along, especially in terms of artists that have engaged with the artificial in the context of artificial intelligence. I should mention that before I studied media studies, and I did my PhD in this field. Actually, I never studied media studies. I studied film studies, and I did my PhD in media studies. And then I worked as a kind of curator, artist, independent culture producer in between Denmark and Copenhagen before moving to Berlin. And one of the things that kind of I've been passionate about is, for example, overhead projectors, which was one of my first kind of curatorial artistic projects. It was a festival called The Art of the Overhead, entirely devoted to this seemingly archaic medium of the overhead projector. I'm mentioning that also because the way that I dealt with it was quite a Guattari-inspired approach. I call it in my PhD transversal media practices, and trying to look at a specific medium, like, for example, the overhead projector, but also looked at television. It's this very institutionalized, almost invisible media that have been, activated by artists, of course, but also that they figure in an institutional context. They figure in a production of subjectivity, and I'm trying to kind of look at how specific art practices have been able to work across the different contexts in which a medium is active, rather than having a very medium-centric approach. Like, I worked a lot within the field also of media archaeology, but I tried to kind of reconcile their attention between so-called German media theory, which is very technical-centric, and a more culture studies approach by actually acknowledging the coexistence of both of these. And it's kind of what I call transversal media practice. And yeah, that's a bit more of the conceptual background of my work. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Sebastien Pluot. I'm an art historian and curator. I'm the co-director with Mo Jacquin, who is also an art historian and curator of Art by Translation, which is a research and exhibition program based in between Europe and North America. And we started developing this program 5 years ago. And the main topic we're addressing through various forms, it can be exhibitions, seminars, symposiums, we produce a lot of works and exhibitions, is the topic of translation in the arts. So like classically we identify like 3 kinds of translation: the kind of interlinguistic, the most like obvious, which is a translation from one language to another, but also intralinguistic, which is, for example, the metaphor, the idest. When you say idest and you reformulate something, it's an act of translation. But also another one called intersemiotic translation, which is translating from one medium or one semiotic system to another. So we examine through various artworks from the beginning of the 20th century, and some references that can go behind, but mainly 20th century and today, until today. Artworks that we examine through the lens of translation theories, meaning the idea that translation is the way or to conceive translation is always revealing of ideology and beyond aesthetic dimensions. And for example, there was one important project for us that we keep on working on called The House of Dust by Alison Knowles, which gathered all the 3 kinds of translation I just presented. It's one of the first computerized poems that she did in 1967, where she used a computer to generate random permutations of specs for houses. So she identified a kind of program with 4 specs, like the context, the material, the context, or the situation, light system, and people inhabiting the house. And so she asked James Tenney, an engineer at Bell Lab, to generate random permutation. So it's chance, which is produced by a computer, which is supposedly not able to generate chance operations. And nevertheless, what was generated is this kind of unexpected meetings between these specs, where in a way she used or misused the technology that was supposed to enhance or to optimize or to generate more effective process of building, for example, houses, or define new forms and could be more appealing. But she completely went on the other side, mainly on the unexpected and more like on the using that as a trigger to generate imaginary architecture.
Okay. Do you want to start?
How you want to begin? I can start with my kind of.
You should go first.
Okay, sorry about that. So how do I kind of my contribution to this idea of artificial? So, kind of understanding that it's dual. You know, there's the image, the front piece by Avraham Boss of Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, 1651. It's this drawing turned into an etching, turned into a print of the sovereign made out of tiny, tiny people on the horizon, hovering over the countryside, a city, and then the sovereign has a crown and is holding a mast and a sword. So within, for example, this matters of fact to matters of concern, this kind of the Making Things Public project by Bruno Latour. He also goes back to this image and basically he said, so society also has objects in it that are of course coded and so on. But I was, which is of course not Latourian to make it a Marxist thing, but it is Marxist because someone had to make that sword. Mm-hmm. Those same people who are looking at the sword as a symbol of power, also the people who made it, so the fetish comes in and so on. So that's my understanding of that image. That was my understanding of that
When
image.
the fetish comes in.
Yeah. So, but that was my understanding, kind of thinking about it. But then, actually, when you read Hobbes, it produces this, kind of generates this idea that we are now in the moment of its collapse, in a way, where he says that the sovereign is an artificial soul. An artificial soul, for him, meaning man-made soul, in the sense that it has wants and needs, but it is man-made in the sense that it's an institution. It's a legal construct that then someone has to feel. Someone has to sit there and be the sovereign, like in flesh and blood. But it's a metaphor in a way, the artificial soul. So this is that, and the artificial soul is kind of made of this multitude. Yeah. And then on the other hand, we have this idea of artificial intelligence now, which, there are many ways to describe artificial intelligence, and I think, some of you have more, knowledge of this than me. And but from what I understand, it's again a metaphor for something that is not really intelligent in the sense that it's reflective. It's again an agglomeration of, the aggregating live the movement of people with the feedback back from their movement. So, all those kind of going around, the traffic or whatever, those kind of apps, that's how they kind of work. There's no intelligence there in that sense that it's the devices in the car, it's giving back the information, it's going back, so it's moving all the time, and everybody's informed on who's ever registered to the app is informed in that location. So I was thinking of the image that we usually assign to kind of artificial intelligence, which is this kind of, can it do this cultural differentiation that we can do between a chihuahua and a blueberry muffin? This kind of tapestry of and that's also a multitude of faces standing for, artificial intelligence in this case. And with Avraham Boss, 1651, the image for Leviathan, it's also a multitude of faces making the sovereign.
Was there something ironic to shift from the rabbit duck to the chihuahua muffin, or?
That's the multi-stable. That's even more. Yeah, that gets it. It's even more complicated. But which maybe is a good idea to. It is a good idea to think about it. I just don't know what I have is interesting to say about it. But what is happening right now, right, is that those moments where you have, for example, the British Prime Minister is doing this Schrödinger Brexit, where it will be and it won't be part of the EU in Northern Ireland, and the same goes for his actual office. Like, he is the artificial soul, the Prime Minister. It's supposed to be the Queen, yeah, but and so the Parliament is sending a letter to the EU, and he at the same time sends another letter to the EU, although that first letter is also his because he's representing the Parliament. And you see this also, in the US with all the corruption of the president. Is he promoting himself or, US interest? That's very simple for all of us to know what's going on. But I just mean that whole mechanism of the artificial soul is kind of collapsing as something that, it's not so common to kind of believe that this system works anymore. That was built back then. And then at the same time, we shift from the sovereign as artificial soul to surveillance to artificial intelligence. So that's kind of where I am with this. And yeah. You wanted to say something, Sebastien, no?
No, it made me think about the quantic politics. It's 0 and 1 and perhaps. And so it's not just like, is it part of it or not part of it? There's this kind of third dimension where... Sorry.
Yeah, no, but within sovereignty, it's kind of impossible to have the third. For example, I come from Israel, which is a place that, what are the scenarios for dividing the space and so on? They can never come up with a kind of, even with the most... people who are obsessed with maps over there cannot come up with a kind of how to cut the map, because it's also three-dimensional and so on. So with sovereignty, they're kind of compelled to do the 0 or 1, and there's no perhaps.
No, even though precisely all the catastrophe in politics today are generated by people bringing complete chaos, precisely saying yes and no simultaneously, on the kind of completely dumb way of Trump, but also on Macron's way of saying it's that, but it's like that also.
Yeah.
Quantum politics.
Quantum politics.
Quantum futurism. But are you suggesting there is a shift in the paradigm of the artificial or not in relation to intelligence, in relation to the political reality of Hobbes' many faces? Because it seems to me that your thesis would suggest that then actually an artificial intelligence sovereign would be much more adequate because you wouldn't have the ambiguity of the personality and the general intelligence.
So I think that is what informs the imagination of the making of artificial intelligence, that it comes from that world, definitely.
Yeah.
Even though, we think of these as new things, but they're basically trying to cement those structures, but at the same time those structures are losing. So like to give kind of another metaphor, I live now in Philadelphia, and they're all about the Constitution there, and they love this document, and it's a document that its imaginary is the steam engine. So you have self-regulating system, you have balance of power. Those kind of ideas come from the actual steam engine in England and in North America and in other places, but it's like a 17th, 18th century kind of imagination. And with the digital, like you're saying, with the 0 and 1, you see that whole thing doesn't work. I mean, they hit a wall time and time again. I mean, Boris Johnson is one example, having to go back to Charles I, which also has to do with 3D scanning, but that's from the art history perspective, which is kind of an anecdote. But, and the American Constitution, does it work with Trump? Okay, what's going on there? And so they really, the political elites still really believe in those scenarios that these documents enable, but those scenarios are based on steam engine logic, I would say, and we are now in like something else. So I think applying that imaginary, like you're saying, Kristoffer, like applying that imaginary of the artificial soul of like 17th century political theory to today, it doesn't. That's what the technological utopists would say, but it doesn't seem to actually work. So Bahar, maybe you will.
Yeah, I feel bad for shifting the conversation.
No,
so
Brent,
much
no, we'll come back to it. Don't worry.
Great
There's a lot
intro.
to.
Yeah, so I thought maybe it would be easier to approach it from a more pragmatic, artistic position. You probably know all about this. You also might have, I assume, you heard the story of Soviet cybernetics in the 60s, 80s. Like they tried to regulate the command economy. In the Soviet Union, and I don't know if I'm talking to an audience or I'm talking in this room, but maybe it would be good to kind of like just open it up, because I think it's related to thinking about protocols and the sovereign, especially in the context of the Soviet Union. But so I actually made a film about this last year or 2 years ago, which kind of goes over these ideas that mainly emerged after the financial crisis in 2008, and a lot of people started to talk about this, including Nick Dyer-Whitford and Benjamin Peters. Benjamin Peters has a very good book on the whole story from the beginning to the end, but basically the way they kind of frame the story, it all starts from this socialist calculation problem, which was posed by the Austrian school economists, namely Hayek and von Mises. And back then, they're basically, and they're right, basically they're saying that the sum of calculations that the socialist economics requires is impossible, because you have to, it's not only about scale, but there's also a question of time, because you have to constantly, in every millisecond, recalculate the supply and demand of the whole system and come up with, best possible form of distribution. And on the other hand, so they kind of propose market as this supercomputer. I mean, they didn't know that market, what is a supercomputer, but the way that they're describing it is, I mean, it's almost, that's what I'm kind of trying to get at. It's more like an AGI, like a general intelligence, rather than what we know as old school cybernetics. Because of this idea of the Adam Smith invisible hand, it kind of carried on towards there. So there's this kind of mystical thing about spontaneity and emergence and things that are still indescribable, but they kind of boil it down to the individual at the center of the market that embodies this. So yeah, and as we know today, I mean, many people again wrote about this. Again, the famous quote by Frederick Jameson, who talked about Walmart as the image of utopia is looming through the mist, and it's Walmart. So the possibility is there, and everyone's talking about that. Centralized economy can happen. It's actually, the infrastructure is in place, Amazon, Google, whatever. And actually 2 days ago, Google announced, you probably saw it, the quantum computers development. I don't know how reliable these news are. It sounds like just one of those. But yeah.
Also, the guy who runs Alibaba, I think he said, coming from a Chinese perspective, now the technology enables us actually to have a totally planned economy, and get rid of scarcity, and everyone can.
Yeah.
So it's within kind of what you're saying about the technology. Sorry.
Yeah. No worries. I don't want to go over it too much, but I'm gonna just maybe shortcut to where I was going with this, but. I think one major kind of issue with thinking around economics, and that's kind of how I'm trying to approach it from an artistic perspective, is this figure of the future is somehow constantly denied, and even in its turn to financialization, finance kind of becomes a symptom almost for this denial of contingency that was always present in economics. And still, in practice, finance is approached with algorithms, and it's actually highly computerized and digitized, the whole system. Whereas, it's pointing to a crisis. So people who write about finance philosophies, like Eddie Ayash, Suhail Malik, they kind of try to maybe frame this problem. But I think, that contingency has something to do with the artificial. That's how I'm trying to think about the artificial as something that might be more related to a notion of time that's missing in the system. And the system, as you say, how we think about it is a set of protocols, or what moves where, people and resources and whatever. I mean, in a way, I was just thinking yesterday, maybe AI appears in science fiction, as we think about, we think AI appears in science fiction because, in our imagination it's inaccessible, but maybe there's actually something ontologically related to the future and artificial intelligence that's not necessarily a matter of, futurity of the scenario. And there's this anecdote that Francis Mackey is a curator in Ireland, I really like the way he frames it, but he talks about telecommunication technologies as they're all invented from the inventors trying to talk to the dead. So there was always this drive of like talking to the dead that was the initial kind of instigation for technology. So I think with AI, there's something about this, like something is transposed from the past to the future. And yeah, the rest of it I can get back to it later.
Now, when you propose this word artificial, I of course immediately jumped to the most like artificial intelligence, and I've been started thinking about there's some kind of very strong, very mediatic announcements of like a state of rupture moments where things got, like for example 3 days ago, this kind of Google big computer who achieved this kind of quantum way of calculation, and so it reminded me some years ago when a computer won against a chess master, and so it was a kind of huge event. And also he won against a Go player, which was supposed to be more complicated than chess. And I remember a mathematician who was asked to react to that, and what he thought about that. And he said that it was not so much about the machine, so an artificial intelligence, being more intelligent than human. It was just revealing the fact that chess is not such an intelligent game. And it made me think about when the inventor of the IQ test, the intelligent test called Alfred Binet, and when he was asked, so it was very early in the 20th century, he was asked what was its definition of intelligence, and he answered, "It is what my test measures." En français, on dit une réponse de Normand. In fact, for me, it tells a lot about the fact that it's easier to define the measure than what is supposed to be measured, meaning what a thinking human head produces. And this, I think, is an interesting symptom of what is already in the etymology of the term artificial, what falsifies nature, and the idea of replacing nature with something that is impossible to contest. This machine is supposed to be fully reliable, 0 and A, and therefore it's. So I've been like going back into this kind of history of this, and to examine this history of the automaton and the use of mathematical, artificial tools that were aimed to be copy or enhance and increase human capacities. It's always for the sake of increasing human capacities. So in a way, artificial intelligence, it's history that we can trace from Pythagoras' attempt to mathematize music or sound. And later, Leibniz's idea of a universal language that would be based on mathematical models in order to convey transparently ideas that wouldn't be interpreted. This is Leibniz's definition of what we now call formal logic, mathematical language, was not supposed to be interpreted. There's no translation. You're supposed to get it right. There's no alternatives. And so in a way, it's more like it was supposed to be more precise and more accurate, and in a way impossible to contest, and for which philosophical axiom would not suffer any interpretation. So that became later the dream of people such as Warren Weaver, the cybernetician, who thought about an artificial algorithmic language would enable to translate transparency from one language to another. I don't know if you know this text. It's a fascinating text that he wrote in the, I think, 48, we were talking about that earlier, with this idea that an algorithm and the computer could stop the wars. wars are coming from misunderstanding between people. They don't get it right. It's irrational. Language is too erratic. We have to mathematize that, and a machine would be able to translate transparently. There won't be any differences between language anymore. So if you push a little bit further, you can imagine what lies behind. Maybe you didn't think about that, but there therefore wouldn't be any difference. Everyone would be exactly the same. So I was interested, thinking about that issue of how it immediately leads to, so artificial leads to an artificial intelligence and the use of cybernetics, always for the sake of, in a way, make the human qualities better. And it made me think in the field of art and architecture of this, there was many projects in the 60s in art, urbanism and architecture that were trying to achieve and show how performative the algorithmic realm and could really transform and make a fantastic life in all its aspects. There's one very famous so-called flat writer by Jona Friedman, where people could write down the kind of definition and transformation of their house, and a computer is calculating all that live with all the kind of the apparatus of the feedback and self-regulate in a kind of complete magical way the environment. So you want to change add another room or wall, it immediately moderates and perform it live. And there's another project which I think is really fascinating. It's called SICK. SICK was designed by Architect Machine Group by Nicolas Negroponte and Marvin Minsky in '69. And for Negroponte, computing must serve the architecture, to react individually. And with his team, they design a connected environment, which is defined as intelligent auto-organizer, which is producing a model based, and it's a kind of template of neural system. And this machine was presented at the Jewish Museum for the exhibition Software, curated by Jack Burnham. And so the display was quite insane. It was a box, plexiglass box, with little cubes that were moved by, how do you say, grue, this kind of grabber, they grab things. It's the game in...
like a claw.
Yeah, exactly. So they were grabbing this little cube and moving it. So there were sensors, video cameras that were recording mice behaviors inside this tank. And with a system of feedback, they were regulating the space where they were supposed to live in order to increase the habitability, increase in favor of their wellness, so that the environment suits them in their way of behaving. So what was not really said is that eventually all this environment was covered with shit, and the mice got really very, very freaked out and started killing each other, and inside a kind of environment of poo, and it was a kind of disaster. Yet, it was...
Because they were thinking of an application of the environment they gave them instead of the environment they need to sustain their life.
Not only sustain life, but increase the well-being of the environment so that people would be happy in a kind of all live controlled and real-time controlled possibility to increase the well-being. And that would have been and in a way it's always for the sake of the better, but the mice didn't really got it. Or
I appreciate it.
And of course, if we go back to the origin of cybernetics, it's aimed as as Norbert Wiener declared and wrote, to control human language and human behavior. And of course, it leads to think about how, like, extremely deeply you have this kind of confrontation and difference between artificial language and ordinary language. So what can be the difference between the two? How can we identify these differences? How artificial language is at the same time template on human language, but at the same time is kind of mathematized in order to rule what's deeply rooted inside language. And already Barthes, in his declaration when he entered the Collège de France, his declaration was called "Language is fascist." And of course, we can wonder how cybernetic, even though it self-proclaims its wish for more democracy, for more well-being for inhabitants or an urban environment, is systematically leading to more and more totalitarian way of use.
That's really powerful stuff. Yeah.
Covered with shit. Okay.
I
fully disagree on that.
I fully disagree. No, I made a lot of similar kind of reflections before coming here to the bunker, and I scribbled things down. But instead of going further into the cybernetic kind of heritage and also discussing its relation to the current AI craze, I would like to kind of ground us actually in the situation of the bunker in relation to the term of the artificial. So this is a little bit like homegrown philosophical attempt, so excuse me for that. But I was really trying to reflect, so around this question, what is artificial to you? I mean, or to me then in that case. But and think about this in relation to sitting here in this bunker, isolated from the outside world, doing a talk proclaimed as a clandestine talk, and well, coming to this term artificial, I immediately started to think about it as something that is fake, that is fictitious, that is aligned with poetry, but also current terms like fake news, propaganda. And it seemed to be, everything that this situation in the bunker is supposedly not. So here we're kind of engaged in an intimate conversation. We'll come to this problematic later, but we're not online. We are online, but let's say we are not online. We are disintermediated, and we are entering into kind of an ideal personal discursive network with each other. And then we can also think about this current political moment and about the populist politics and the kind of revolt against artifice, against the language of true people and not the expert, for example. So there's this whole play, of course, of authenticity in this term. And I perceive this site as potentially authentic. So there is something maybe positive in this about the artificial on a kind of superficial level, that it brings us into a real constellation of relation with each other. But then this is of course a contingent idea also of artificial. It can only be kind of formulated in relation to something which is then not artificial, or and so I came to the bunker as possibly off the grid, possibly non-mediated. But the fact that we are actually online, we're being streamed, contradicts this, of course, totally. I would have wished for, in this idea of the artificial, I would have, and authenticity against each other somehow, I would have wished for a much more radical approach, of course, and that nothing had been, announced, also, or documented online, that nobody even probably knew which topics. Maybe there could be a a cloud somewhere with some associated term, like also in the artwork, but really people wouldn't be able to access so fine-grained information as it is now. So, but I'm recognizing this also as a kind of, as my personal kind of desire for the, living off the grid in a world where one is constantly beset by communication networks and precarious work and so on. So I want to criticize this kind of desire at the same time to make this polarity, and I came up with kind of the statement that we have always been artificial. I would like to embrace this as a kind of a starting point. But and then I would go actually to very similar reflections to what you made, Sebastien. But rather than doing that immediately, we can continue, or somebody else can pick up the thread.
It made me think about. I don't get to Slavoj Žižek so often, but he said something that I thought was really interesting about virtual reality, which is, I think, a subject which is connected.
Definitely.
And someone told him about this kind of people who are completely derealized, because of virtual reality. And he said, in a way, virtual reality would imply that there's some things existing, such as real reality, which is not. And of course, it leads immediately to Lacan saying that there's no such a thing as reality. It's always the trilogy of the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic. And this was something that I think was and something also Avital Ronel went to with this idea that as soon as some technological apparatus states itself to be completely disruptive and another kind of paradigm, and she's always like going back and said, but maybe it have always been like that. She's talking about the people walking in the street with telephones, and they have their hands, grabbed to each other's, and she says like maybe these two people with a telephone, like they're connected with somewhere else, with someone else, which is away, and this is completely like they live in a kind of virtual world. But maybe it already existed before. Maybe it was the same before, with not a telephone but their imagination, which I think is something you moved.
Exactly this concept actually of the virtual. I forgot that point now, but I would like to consider also the bunker as a virtual space, and it's much more virtual reality than when you go and see here on the biennial virtual reality work, putting on these helmets. I believe that the situation we're in here now is much more kind of the virtual idea of coming together in this physical material space while actually existing for the sake also at the same time of mediation or an institutional wish to bring us together that we comply with and we can interact with, of course, and perhaps alter in some way, but definitely this virtuality is so close to artificiality, of course. And the contingency again of the concept, I think.
No, I was thinking in the past week, as you know, there's been the uprisings in Beirut, and finally there's a very similar bunker. I don't know if you've seen that. It's the Egg Building, which was this brutalist architecture supposed to be turned into a cinema, but it's just it's been left there for this construction project for decades. So now people basically occupied the Egg, and these AUB academics who've been on strike basically started to run lectures there. So it's suddenly the function of the bunker is transformed, and this is happening like in parallel to this bunker.
Oh, that's nice. What you were discussing before, I was thinking, Kristoffer, on so actually truth demands protocols, while authenticity, also has protocols, but is perceived as if it doesn't have, in the sense that, take Donald Trump. He is not telling the truth, but he's authentic, like at the same time.
But what kind of authenticity is?
Yes, no, but people perceive him as authentic. He's saying what's on his mind. And when you need to have protocols, for example, journalism, you know, like you have to compare sources and so on, or think about legal language, you know, all those things that people immediately, oh, you speak in this kind of coded professional language, and then kind of truth has protocols in the sense that, yeah, the real maybe we cannot address, but we devised, the civilization, different civilizations devise different ways to kind of come up with the idea of truth. And so, for example, you know, with law and so on, of course, it's very limited. It's all about, you know, factuality and those kind of things, which is only part of the truth. But those kind of things are undermined by authenticity. So truth and authenticity are now like on different poles.
But can we talk about Bastianader rather than Trump for a second? No, I'm thinking about I'm Too Sad to Tell You, which I think is a fabulous work regarding this issue of authenticity, the supposedly authentic emotion versus a kind of rational truth. And what is the first state in this film is, I'm too sad to tell you, so he's using discursive language to state something. He cannot say something. And what he shows is himself crying, which is supposed to be the kind of bodily expression of sincere, authentic truth. What I'm interested in, Ho is, of course, extremely aware of the fact that when we will see him, we might be moved, but we will obviously know that it's fake. It's fake authenticity. So in a way, trying to bring the kind of 18th, 19th century ethos, romantic ethos of the Urphänomen, you know, the romantic deep resonance with nature, which is supposed to be authentic, and bring it into Los Angeles in the 60s is a way, in a way, to disrupt this association between authenticity of the emotion and the kind of the question of virtuality and artificiality of it. Because of course, when he filmed himself crying, when we see himself crying, we have to know that he put himself in front of the camera, he put it on, and he started like faking that he was crying. But at the same time, we don't know exactly if it's completely fake. It's probably there's part of sincerity in that.
but then I have a question. So, okay, you remember in La Chinoise, in the Godard movie,
Yeah.
then Jean-Pierre Léaud is telling this story about the Chinese students. Basically, he's being asked, it's like this supposed mockumentary in a way. Those students, it's summer of '67, they took over one of their parents' house because they went on vacances. And then he's asked a question from behind the camera, and kind of repeats the question, what is an actor? I'll tell you what's an actor. And then he does this thing that for me is like on many, many levels operates. And basically he has this medical, band to cover a wound, like this long band. And he starts covering his face. And while he's covering his face, he's telling this story. Chinese students were standing in the Red Square and were demonstrating against the Soviet government. Because it's, revisionist, it's Brezhnev, it's not revolutionary. China is going through a cultural revolution, and so on. Then they were hit by police brutally. The next day, they come again. And now, by that time, he finished covering his face. They come again, and one of the students his face is covered with bandages, like he just did. And then all the press is coming to him, flocking and taking pictures. Francois, everyone, trying to figure out what's going on with this guy. And he is starting to, he's shouting, look what these, the revisionists of the Soviet Union did to me. Look what they did to me. The student, and he's starting to unveil his face, and nothing happened. Like his face is fine. Everybody's shouting at him, what is this? He's a liar, he's a con man, what is this man? And then Jean-Pierre Léaud is saying, to the camera, no, but you have to understand, this was true theater, this was a reflection on reality. And I would even say, this is the difference between representation and demonstration. So when we cannot represent, with now metadata algorithms, all those things that are beyond our vision, we cannot see, machine vision doesn't need the same conditions as we do. What we can do is demonstrate. So, right, demonstrate relations, demonstrate how things work, kind of. And you see it a lot. I mean, if I can give examples of, different strategies by artists, but I feel even in your Beyond Scarcity, it's like, it's the software, the text, all those things are coming out of Bahar, your video, I mean, because the audio doesn't say who I'm looking at. So in your video, Bahar, Beyond Scarcity, what you have is exactly, actually demonstrating a relation with reality, not just, representing it, because we're always too short to represent it, like you're saying, because of language, because of our relation to language, actually, our kind of distrust with it. So anyway, what this is, I don't know, I was just thinking of, because this example goes with me, like, for different reasons, but this kind of the relation between representation and demonstration.
Yeah.
Would you add performative? Because demonstration for me relates very much still to representation. Like here, I will demonstrate, but there was a clear performative, like an active kind of enactment rather than maybe demonstration.
Enactment. Yes, that's a good. Yeah.
That leads to question the notion of insincerity and the self-proclaimed sincerity. And how rational it is organized. Recently, there was I listened to a conference of someone who is a specialist of the affects in middle age, and he completely transformed the kind of historical construction from the early 20th century by Michelet, for example, who said that we identified in the Middle Age the fact that at the time they were like behaving like kids, that the emotionally they were kids, they were like kings were crying, yelling, and they were like over demonstrating things and going from one emotion to another at the opposite in a second. And so Michelet's understanding of this kind of way of dealing with emotion was a kind of teleologic one, that middle-aged child, then, the rational enlightenment brings a kind of, is completely transforming that so that the emotions are going withdraw, and the substitute is rationality and so on. And to come to the kind of 20th century, which is supposed to be like a grown-up thing, okay, like we don't count the millions of dead people who were killed, so it's not so rational in the 20th century compared to Middle Age. And so what this historian is saying is that all that is a complete invention, and he examined extremely deeply how in the Middle Age there was extremely acted emotions, but in an extremely rational way. It was very coded, extremely coded, and it must have looked like artificial. It must have looked like sincere at the same time, but it was very coded, extremely organized and socially.
I mean, almost
based on social
ritualistic.
conventions. Sorry.
Almost ritualistic, which actually makes me think about, because even with performative, I'm not very convinced that leaves out the representation, because of this presence of the ritual. Like there's something that's maybe socially constructed, which goes back to language again. Yeah. And it's funny, like we're going around so many psychoanalytic notions, like the mistrust for language with Lacan, or they really don't believe in like someone crying in front of them. Like that doesn't mean anything. Yeah. The presence of affect, but there's also this. Andy Warhol had a famous quote. He said, what happened to emotions after the 60s? And then he said, nothing, they're still out there, but there are no more hours. So it's like this kind of, it became a cloud, it turned into something else, it's just a disembodiment.
Well, there is this whole field, of course, today of so-called effective computing, and Affectiva is probably the most famous example of this startup that works in this domain. I mean,
Artificial emotions.
stating the obvious of, artificial emotion, but actually, as you were talking about optimization, optimizing or our own emotions through technology that in turn has then objectified and datafied and established a model of human emotion. I mean, this is the basis also.
But on a rational basis.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're here, and you don't have, I think, anymore this opposition between the rational and the emotional, or even the affective domain. And actually, going back to Shannon and Weaver and the mathematical theory of information, this famous paper from 1948. I'm not sure if it's the same paper you discussed, but there they also clearly say that actually, this theory doesn't have anything to do with the meaning in a hermeneutical sense, of messages. It's the signal to noise ratio is what matters, and how that information is classified, and therefore also human emotion can be, of course, stratified in this way, and that's why new patents have been registered not so long ago, also in relation to Amazon's Alexa, just to name one example, where the software is detecting emotional timbres in the voice of the user and perhaps suggesting certain course of actions based on that. So, I don't know how we came here.
It made me think about the artificial voice.
Psychoanalyst.
And there's this advertising, I think it's 1964, 65. So it's Bell Lab. They had this new fantastic tool that was a revolution, where you would enter one punch card, and it would make a voice like that. And then you add another punch card, and it was more human. It sounded less artificial. And at the end, what they do is that they ask the computer to sing a song. So they add another punch card with a song, and the computer sings Daisy. This song, Daisy, Daisy. Give me your answer too. It's a story of marriage. They don't have a lot of money, but they will have a fantastic wedding. So it's a kind of it's a mise en scène of a kind of wedding between human and machine, where machine is making an artificial copy of what is supposed to be the more human emotions. And what's funny is that it's exactly the same song that Stanley Kubrick used at the end of 2001. Where he unplugged the punch cards and the computer dies. And the computer, Al, is asking, can I sing you a song that my conceptor, my engineer, used to sing for me? And it's Daisy, Daisy again. So the kind of divorce and ends like almost 3 years after the kind of IBM marriage.
Can I tell a story? Because my grandfather he's passed away, but he worked in the Swedish taxation system, so to speak. He was like a boss of a local county office, and he was involved in the computerization of the Swedish tax and civic registration, which was like the biggest computerization project in the welfare state in the 50s and 60s. And what happened was that a colleague of his was running one of these kind of first data centers, which was basically a whole cellar with an IBM system, 1401 system. And there they discovered that by using, or they didn't discover it there, but the people who were working there were using the system also to produce music, and not through the punch cards, and a specific printer, which was one of the first kind of mass-produced kind of office printers, but it had like a revolving, very heavy revolving chain on which like the print hammer was hitting, and it could produce apparently also a range of 3 octaves. So by feeding these punch card systems with nonsense data, nonsense in relation to kind of civic and text registration, they were doing exactly these kind of songs, like actually Daisy, or she'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. Somebody at IBM maybe in the US had figured this also out and spread this further to the to the Swedish bureaucrats. And it so happened then that they got a visit from a Tanzanian exchange student group. There was a lot of kind of third world like development cooperations going on with Sweden and the newly kind of post-colonial states at that time. And what they did at this particular tax office was that they reprogrammed, or they created a program where they could play the new Tanzanian national anthem, which was like co-written by Julius K. Nyerere, who was one of these famous kind of first post-colonialist leaders in Africa. So this kind of meeting between the human and the machine and the kind of post-colonial context, for me it's like a story that really, it talks about also a little bit this kind of the breakdown, of course, of the functionality of using these systems within against the grain, but also like the very mundane character of all these so-called artificial intelligence system, because I really believe that we can call most of software development artificial intelligence. The ordering and sorting through algorithmic operations, data based on some kind of human organization or activity, it is what artificial intelligence is mostly about. It's not about creating this general emulation of intelligence that we don't know what it is in the first place. But where we start to look at these kind of instances where some kind of creative gap or some kind of dialogue, as in this case, you have to kind of analyze it further, I think, to see also problematics in it. But this kind of, these white engineers who wanted to demonstrate the amazing wonders of their of their system, but they came up with doing this music. I think is kind of it is this reinsertion of poetics sometimes that maybe also make us see the limits of these systems and kind of ground a little bit more our understanding of them, rather than buying into the Ray Kurzweil singularity.
I remember being as a kid, they would have this joke about appliances. If it's expensive, what, can you also make tea? You know this kind of saying? You know this? Like if you would get this basic computer, then why is it so expensive? So it would, like you're saying, it has also other functions that are, helping us outside of what it was designed for.
Against the grain, I think, is something extremely important. That and it not only comes from a poet or artist. I was talking about The House of Dust by Alison Knowles earlier, where she's going against the grain of the technology. But the first computer-generated poem was earlier, like something like 10 years earlier, in the end of the 50s, by Theo Lutz, and who was an engineer. And what he did was to produce random permutations of sentences coming from, and he didn't choose it by chance, coming from The Castle by Kafka, which is, of course, the representation of the kind of nightmare of administration and of dictatorship and like the super controlled environment and political system. And I thought that was like something like readdressing Kafka's, and in a kind of clandestine way, inserting it into the machine to go against its grain and to also reshuffle Kafka, like using the Kafkaian machine in order to reshuffle for today. So what with these words that Kafka put on paper, that was printed, should continue to be translated for today, and continue to address how the artificial technologized human, based on this kind of rational, incontestable parameters or mathematics, could like address like continually, because the poem is endless. You can reshuffle Kafka's text endlessly.
So he did the first so-called electronic literature, which became kind of paradigm.
I have a bit of a maybe abstract opposition to the kind of, the hacking scenarios. Because I think what it mostly, at least, like as we see happening these days, the whole discourse of hacking does is, in a kind of twisted way, it essentializes the medium as, this is the only way it can be. Whereas, like, if you think about it, like something like internet, again, going back to the Soviet case, there is something about the contingent history, which is it could be something else. But it doesn't mean that, this thing at the moment is, has like, the potential, as if it's not like necessarily in the present of the medium. Like we can think about it more on a timeline, in a non-linear way maybe. But I think especially with finance, like I find it a bit difficult when people try to experiment with the medium as is now, whereas like there might be ways of just like thinking about it radically differently. It's like it's so much like fatalism in like engaging with the machine. I think that's what I'm trying to say, that you don't even try to get near it. It's like you gave it up to Google and whatever, and that's it. And
now it's just variations. Like you say, you have the Kafka text, it's a given, and now it's variations on that. And it can be, probability and there's probability there, but there's no possibility, to get out of it. But I wouldn't maybe go back because okay, so we focused on the device, right, in like different ways. But to go back to something Kristoffer also said, and also Sebastien gave an example of, kind of the being without the device. Like maybe they already communicated through their imagination with others, right? You gave this example of Avital Ronel with the people with the telephones. So I'm thinking of, it's again a Godard example. He has this TV series, 6x2, like this, with the Anne-Marie Mieville TV series, which is really, he has so many masterpieces, but this is also a masterpiece. The TV series, it's all available on YouTube. And just
what's it in English?
It's called the 6x2.
Oh.
And it's like images, and then they describe them, but then when they are formulated as words, they change their meaning totally, and back and forth, and really like, it's really fantastic, and I think there's a lot of Anne-Marie Mieville in it, the kind of the playfulness and that she brings to the collaboration. But in any case, there's a moment where you see, it's all footage, like kind of found footage situation, and you see someone walking a dog, and it's a kind of, the voiceover is a conversation. What do you see? And he's saying, I see a man walking a dog. No, I see people on a telephone. Because the person is communicating with the dog through a cable, right? I mean, so it's those kind of things that maybe even without the...
So it's before the Wi-Fi, because...
totally. But I mean to say that, it's a landline. But then at the same time, I mean, we know that, devices are apparatuses, and they come with a set of... And especially when it becomes algorithmic, and the system we're in is so, how should I say, hermetic in a way. So things are amplified, a million times more than they used to be. There's no life outside of, like, today kids age 10 would try and kill themselves because of bullying, which, when I was a kid, they wouldn't, because that environment that bullies them didn't encapsulate their whole life. But now with social media and all those things, there's not a moment that they can get out of it. And so this is the amplification of the system. What I mean to say, maybe it's more like kind of biblical, that the device brings new laws. So, when Moses comes with the tablets, its new laws come with the idea that you can, from the pyramids, you can actually have some kind of a more dynamic situation that laws can be written on something that moves. You know, it's not hieroglyphs on a static building. So just kind of this relation to the. I want to propose like kind of a looking at our relation to devices, apparatuses, and so on.
And this is a very good description of AI, actually, as the generation of the new is actually in the rules, not so much in content. I mean, it's an interesting way of looking at it, maybe not.
That's why AI is so good at playing chess, because it's a rule form, you know, it's formal rule-based system.
But I understand that when Kasparov was playing, he played 3 times, so he lost. But then the last time, he won because he didn't play to win. You know, because the computer was programmed that the other side is trying to win. But if he was playing not to win, which is a capacity a human has, you know, to kind of improvise on that level, you know, like, and so he was able to counter the computer's.
So meaning the computer was programmed against someone who is willing to win.
Who only wants to win, but he was going for a tie or for losing, and so it confused
Trump's
the
strategy.
Maybe this is what...
But Trump is the human or the machine? It's also,
Historically, when in psychological experimentations, you know, the early ones, you know, it started like early 20th century with someone who identified like the fact that when someone is on the bicycle is cycling alone, he goes less fast than someone who is in competition with. So the kind of modelization of behaviors was always for the sake of winning in terms of quantification. But the bicycle man was not asked, do you prefer to bike alone or with someone by a lake, like with a sunset, or, you know, it was just the measure of the speed and not the pleasure to make bike. So that's interesting that the machine failed as soon as he wanted just to enjoy moving the chess and have fun, you know. It was not like there was no goal.
It's also, I mean, I'm thinking with generative neural networks, you know, the way they work, neural networks. So maybe the basic form of them, you know better, Kristoffer, but basically there are 2 competing algorithms, and it's actually a very productive form of sabotage. Like, you can think about it as like capitalism 2.0. Like, they actually, in trying to defeat each other, they learn, you know, and they grow together as so.
Nasty.
So this idea of like winning is a bit twisted, because basically there are multiple actors in the system, so it's not you as yourself as the singularity trying to win.
I think this change of behavior in Kasparov, it's definitely related to so-called generative adversarial networks. It's something which is becoming much more and more like a thing today, is these so-called adversarial attacks, which are not actually hacks in the sense of, okay, I'm breaking into the code, but you realize that the machine or the algorithm is reacting to data in a certain way. It's trying to optimize a certain way of behaving, and therefore it could also start to optimize slightly differently. And it produces maybe not like a formal error in the system, you know, it's not like you broke the code, but you broke what it was trying to achieve in relation to what we perceive as the goal of the system, when we, from the designer's point of view, or from the, I mean, with self-driving cars, for example, this is like something which is now being discussed, that you can kind of put just objects that will be misread, so it will think there is a road there, and actually for the machine there is a road there, but it's actually just like a black hole, or you know, like these kind of actually soft non-code ways of hacking. It's also referred to now like as adversarial hacking. There's a new book by Meredith Broussard, I think, which is artificial unintelligence, which doesn't actually mention, I think, adversarial, but it's all about those kind of errors.
What's the name?
Meredith Broussard, like a French
Yeah.
sounding name, but she's at MIT. Yeah.
It's like tough love, kind of.
But when you say, okay, so this, because I was also thinking, okay, so there is a shift also, I feel, I mean, from when we talk about, let's say, reproductive labor, because, you said tough love, so, and love and, supporting life, creating life, the entanglement also of basically reproducing ideology that is oppressive to the people who is reproducing it, all this kind of theory of around reproductive labor. But then with automation, like one of the things, I'm doing studio visits, okay, in different art schools in the US, and I had in the same school 2 female artists. One is a painter and one is a sculptor. And while they are doing work, they're doing something called camming. You know what that is?
Camming?
Camming. It's like you go online to a website, you have to pay or you don't have to pay, and there's a live stream of a girl basically doing like kind of like a striptease.
Okay.
But it's, she put it's a laptop there, right? In a room doing that, and you can write here, and she comes to the computer and she writes back, and sometimes she has a neck mic so you can hear what's going on. So one is a painter while painting doing camming, and the other she, as a sculptor, she did just drywall for the space where she was going to do the exhibition, but doing it in this way. So what is the place for women in the kind of the digital? It's camming, like after when also reproduction is taken from them with all that is the oppressive nature of how it is, managed in our society, civilization. Now when they become unexploitable to some extent. So they I think you understand what I'm trying to say is like, so where's the place of love, for example, with automation? And specifically you see it on what's going on with women. I think it's not a mistake that all this violence for women, it's true to France, it's true to Israel, like these places where you have this kind of horrible domestic violence taking place, like huge numbers every week, and it has to do with this crisis of meaning, and on another kind of more basic economic level, it's the kind of the shift that we're all experiencing from production to the, how's it called in Marxist terms, point of realization. No one's talking about workers' rights, but you will talk about rents, or you will talk about that kind of Louis C.K. joke that the person that he's on a plane and there's Wi-Fi and everybody's so excited because it's the first time you have Wi-Fi, but then there's the guy who's like, his Wi-Fi doesn't work for a second, and he's like, what's going on? Because the point of it, we're so frustrated. Also, railroads in the US, it's like, it's all those things that have to do with, we don't have access to that vocabulary that has to do with reproductive labor. And when we are, and productive labor also, and where we are now is like with this automation, and with automation, like buffering, the rage of buffering.
It's a syndrome of prosthesis that generate disabilities.
Yes, and specifically you see it on the, I feel like, anyway, that's my...
How do you relate that with the idea of artificiality? The idea that the machine artificially generates a desire.
No, but also automation, so life. The idea that life can be produced outside the female body. Like, there is this imagination, right? And there is the imagination of, eternal life for the super rich. In Silicon Valley, they have these ideas, like a vampire kind of logic. So all those things are kind of embedded with this misogynism and a denial of basically a person who is perceived as a woman from any agency. I think that's what the digital is, and it's not.
So it's not so much her work that has values; it's her body producing the work, which is filmed. Right?
That used to be the case, like that's reproductive labor. You take care. Basically, a woman is twice being impoverished because she is kind of producing and taking care of the labor power that will then be exploited, and she doesn't have access to labor, and with what it can claim when it's organized and so on. And if you think about it, I mean, I have this idea, U.S. 2008, the elections, they had the primaries were Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. He's supposed to be this kind of figure that stands for the civil rights movement, and she's for feminism. But you knew that both of them will give Wall Street whatever it wants, right? So you're in a situation where what we call feminism is basically a two-income household. It's a necessity in a world where, labor moved from those big industrial centers in the north, west, in Europe, in the US, somewhere else, and then women have to also cover for that. And now, when kind of labor is leaving even the assembly line for automation, then I think again women are those who have to pay for that back in the point of realization.
I don't follow that end conclusion. Though. Like, how do you?
Because I
see
look,
the-
so the
yeah.
digital revolution, where are women? Camming. You know what I mean? Like, okay, so there's this lady, works with Zuckerberg, Cheryl. Okay, but where are we? I mean, is the digital a female project, a feminist project? On the level of the reality, it's not. You know what I mean? Like, who is doing this thing?
Well, I have to evoke cyber-feminism, though.
Yes, but that's a resistance to,
Yeah.
to
So
a reality.
artificial-
For sure, I'm taking all these ideas from cyberfeminism. I'm not. That's where I'm. But it's kind of not. It's happening at the same time that you have, the Amazon going on and ban on abortions at the same time. I mean, I see how it's not competing. It's not like this is backwards and this is forward. No, they're both of the same moment, because that forward is just another. It has so many publics that it's kind of cannibalizes on.
Sorry. Now, just on the topic of camming, I watched only last week a 2-hour documentary on Chinese live streamers, which covers exactly this phenomenon. But the filmmaker, she had chosen to focus not on like the celebrity streamers, because live streaming has become a huge phenomenon in China. Now they're censoring and closing down some of these platforms, but it was focused really on like marginal, like people really on the margins of society, like handicapped or I don't know, unemployed or very low wage, very precarious labor, crane drivers. Like there's such a variety of sweatshop workers, of people that are actually streaming just from the everyday situations. Maybe initially with some hope that they would, become internet celebrities, and you can earn some money. So they constantly get these messages. So and so user have gifted you 2 tiger coins, and they're like, thank you. But actually they're very, very lonely. But you get like a reciprocity feeling that the people watching them are also quite lonely. And but what this film kind of in a way conveys is a little bit contradicting this idea of it's a purely kind of exploitation, because clearly for these people have no friends and have almost no chance of getting any friends in real life. So this whole idea of the internet as a space to actually connect and make friends and to have a kind of a artificially produced social life in that very basic sense of the artificial. And I think this is not unresolved just by applying the Marxist perspective. I think that there is still this tension within net culture, however we kind of think it's all platformed and it's all datafied, and but it still affects people on this level.
But it's true too. Fireworks in China are the same chemical substance as gunpowder in Italy, right? I agree, the device has a limited kind of, it can do different things, it's how we use it, but it also comes with like the world in which it was developed. And this world, this is how, and for those art students, sometimes it's this idea that how can painting takes so much time. How can I do something else while I'm doing this? And I need money, because there's no, how do I generate an income while I'm doing my art? Okay, I'll do this scamming, this kind of logic that also the digital offers.
And they never thought about doing
Especially with the art economy. I mean, it's interesting that
Action
it's
painting?
post-Fordism around art markets. Because like your work doesn't sell anyways. Like I mean, if you do paintings, maybe, but
also it's not any spring. Like when they have a crit about these things, I ask them. So what are you talking? I mean, if you need money when you finish your degree, go into banking. That's where you make money. Nobody went to these kind of things and came out with money. That's not maybe the agents or whoever owns the platform makes money, but the person who was actually performing, that's not what happens with them usually. But
even though in some art school they train them in order to perform their way to sell their work.
Yes, but I mean that this scanning thing.
They're very trained.
And so in the critique, they would talk to them about any sprinkle and things like that. And it is not. I think it has nothing to do with any sprinkle. Any sprinkle is like someone who actually asserts authority through irony. I mean, there's so.
So do they make it part of their practice, or?
They're looking. They're in art school, so they're looking for different things, and this is where they are now with their painting while camming. And I'm like, so Yves Klein, that's painting while just do Yves Klein. Take your body, cover it with paint, and you know what I mean. Like from the perspective of the art
school, was a good businessman.
Yes, but for her today, the better business is to go into banking anyway. I think, but you know what I mean. Like anyway, I noticed this kind of tension that is taking place.
It's also a really interesting moment of the network having become so infrastructural that it is similar to TV, to kind of you turn on the TV while cooking or constantly have TV on in your home. Now you have instead the stream that
is constantly
goes the other way in a way, constantly on. But there's nothing sensational about it. Like it's the new medium, the new network infrastructure, media condition in that sense, right?
This makes me think, actually, this is a great example of something that I was... So, when Martin Luther, he has to talk about images, and I think it's 1529, right? Like, okay, he has this sermon about the printed image, and he says, it's not like for him, it's not like with the Catholic, it's not like representing. It is, and it's also kind of low res, right? It's a woodcut that then becomes a print, so everybody knows that it's not this amazing Baroque thing that's going on with the Catholics. It's something else. And so, what is that thing? And so he calls it memory image, Merkbild. How do you say it in German?
Yeah, but I don't know this kind of terminology.
So but anyway, it's like this. It's the combination of the two words. Like memory image. And the memory image is exactly what you're saying. I mean, what are we doing when we touch the screen? What is the camera? This kind of Hitlerstyle explanation of how the camera on the telephone works. That it basically only knows what it already knows. It's based on what you already took, photos. It's also true to your digital camera when you had to adjust from landscape to portrait in the past, because it has a reference of what it's about to look at based on what it already knows. So every image is a memory image. So for Martin Luther, memory image means every image reminds you of, divine law.
So it's something with the Gedächtnisspiel.
Okay, yes. And at the same time, for us, what is the memory image? Like, what is the material from which the digital is made? Capital. So finance, yeah. So this is what everything reminds you, like that streaming, you just turn on the streaming. It's in order to be in the world in a way, because when you are by yourself just cooking, you're in the bunker, or something. Thank God we're streaming because we're in the world, you know what I mean? And the digital is kind of, even these tubes is like, the people with the oxygen mask that we're wearing now, the oxygen mask in the hospital is like, this is connecting us to the veins. The digital is, that's the formation of something else, which is capital, that, So it makes sense what we're doing. We're not just talking. We're not just we're in the world somehow. So, and this is the platformization and so on. But it's Martin Luther is like my way into it. But I feel like you gave the example of, so it doesn't matter what's going on. It's not sensational, but it's to remind us. It's like a memory image rather than a representation.
Regarding this notion of artificial and what you just said, and it might like sound weird to jump from that to that, but I've been thinking about the statement of Marcel Brotters. Where he shifted from words to image, and where he self-declared himself as inauthentic, as artificial, and adding, me too, I would like to become successful and make money, therefore I would make an inauthentic visual artwork. And immediately he's describing the contract with his gallery. They will take a part of the money and the other part. And I was wondering what like just to bring that Brotters statement of artificiality, like proclaiming itself critically, of course, artificiality through inauthenticity.
Like poetry is the kind of the truth, right? As opposed to art where there's a market, so it becomes tainted, and therefore you can be, so basically every person in the art world is an artist, no matter who, but what kind, a con artist, right? On that kind of level, the gallerist, the curator, the artist, everybody's kind of trying to get a better deal from everybody. That's while a poet is supposedly just speaking the truth. I don't know if that's true. Knowing poets, they're big manipulators.
Precisely, at the time, Brotters was deconstructing that, and I'm wondering who today we could identify
but you can also
as people who deconstruct. This is what I first thought of Ito Steil, for example. But I think she moved away from this kind of position.
But I would go back instead of forward, in the sense that once poetry was what then science took over, and that is the way to tell the truth. This is Homer. You tell the people what happened in the world, what's happening, how the world works. This is supposed to be poetry, to report about all the human experience possible, and then comes science and takes over the kind of, and it holds to this day to an extent, this kind of authority of whatever is scientifically proven is also limited in time, because the whole apparatus is supposed to be that they will be proven wrong because there's a new thing that proves it. So, until it is, how's it called? It's true until it is being refuted.
It's refuted,
Yeah. So this logic that science has kind of took over from poetry. But what do you mean with Hito that shifted or?
Because she was using of a kind of forum in the field of art that was through which she very strongly revealed some hidden aspects of the kind of artificial probity and progressivity and this kind of artificial this facade in the world in the art world of probity, of progressist, whereas when we identify the reality that it's a system which is run by money, and the fact that people who are showing supposedly very advanced exhibition are treating their employees like animals.
I'm thinking about inauthenticity.
And there's a kind of statu quo of we should keep this artificial, all this hidden, which is completely so it's artificial, progressist statement or cover or facade.
I think the relationship between the inauthenticity here is interesting to indeterminacy, as Suhail Malik describes, which is, I think that's where you're going at with the Hito case. And the indeterminacy is more of a intentional inauthenticity. I think it kind of like brings it back to like what would be an intentional, inauthenticity, which is the condition of neoliberalism. Like that's what allows art market to survive. That's what he's saying. That you need to be free in a sense to, be mobilized on a free market.
Yeah.
And the freeness is like open-endedness and wishy-washiness and just like, a criticality that doesn't quite work. Yeah, I'm thinking about that twisted inauthenticity.
No, I'm talking about Ito Steyer because at some point the work is so heavily produced. There's so much money in the production of a work that at some point you can like, what is she? What's the point of denouncing something from a place where she's kind of became a symptom of
Or
the
like the
system?
whole Whitney biennial every 2 years.
Yeah.
Like everyone's waiting for the Whitney crisis this year. What's gonna happen?
But sorry. Go ahead.
No, this is in a way is the whole demise of like institutional critique that you're speaking about. I remember that one of the books I have on this subject, institutional critique, it is called, is co-edited by Hito Steyer. But I think already there, this book is already like 10, 15 years old. This whole trajectory is being described, how, from the artist criticizing the institution to the institution criticizing itself, and then
and the institutionalization of critique.
Yeah, and the critique of of critique as such, of course, but.
And now it's the industrialization of critique.
Industrialization of critique also, but I think this also kind of being self-aware about the futileness of critique and being kind of meta about it as an art institution is something even that is now like, very much a strategy and kind of a disarming of critique by ascribing to the critique of critique as well, and then finding kind of artistic trends that corresponds to this. Whereas on the other hand, I think there's a greater public awareness and not so much tied to the individual artistic gesture anymore of the kind of, the demand for more actual transparency in the art and the cultural world. I mean, from everything to wages to sponsorship to environmental politics, and that's something I feel also as an organizer of a festival. And this increasing kind of actually pushed against the artificiality of cultural events that has really become much more heated. It's been there for a long time, but in the past few years, you have much less kind of maneuver room today to kind of be playful as a cultural institution, thinking that it doesn't have consequences.
But I think, well, specifically just in relation to Hito, I think one of the things that she's doing, and also it's true to Trevor Peglin, I mean, kind of short on time, so I'll just say that, it's a generalization, but they would make these metonyms, meaning that there's a system that we cannot see, but you find an image, even she would show you a static image. It's just this kind of static snow, on TV. And then she would tell you that this is from the Snowden files. And this is actually American technology on an Israeli drone. And that Israeli drone was bombing Gaza. And there was a glitch and there wasn't a documentation of the explosion. And so you have this static and a girl lost her eyesight. So it's all based on facts. And so that image becomes the image of blindness of the victim. So this lyrical kind of metonym, she would do that. Same goes for Trevor Peglin and others, but the Harun Farouki kind of, I think, kind of way of doing it.
Which was done by an artist 15 years ago in Venice Biennale, the snow that testifies from, so a message from André. From Joachim Koster.
Yeah. So, but just but this kind of, I mean, okay. So this way of working, like taking a detail and explaining a whole system through it, I think then there's this shift, which goes very kind of hand in hand with a kind of an asserted critique. So this is like from one of the biggest stories of our the last decade of journalistic and kind of whistleblower activism, the Snowden, so it gives authenticity to the actual static image because it could be found anywhere and so on. But at the same time, this Harun Farouki kind of model where you play out a system, which comes from the Soviets basically, which comes from Soviet kind of, let's see what cinema can do. So again and again you'll see workers, fine, but every time cinema is doing something else. So in Enthusiasm, Giga Vertov is doing something different than what I don't know is going on in Strike by Eisenstein. But it's for us today, when you show it in class, it's all these kind of black and white workers. But no, it's like the playing out of a system. So I think that's when you need a lot of money. You in the Soviet Union, you need the state to kind of give you the facilities to see how you play out the system. And it can also be very, I don't know if the word critical is but very interesting, first of all, and full of insight but I agree that on the level of like the basic economics, it's like you're now on the other side because you need the kind of the funding for that basically. So that's kind of my.
It's like, like we have to consider in a Marxist sense the material conditions of authenticity too. Like in the 60s, like Martha Rosler was giving a talk when I was in Hong Kong in the summer, and she's talking about like being against the institutions and like living in New York. She lives in New York, and she's like teaching her students don't become part of the system, whatever. It's like how in this current conditions, like how do you actually suggest them to do it? Because when you started your career, like things were radically different, and she knows it too. But
and not only that, and this is maybe my this. I mean, there's a lot of literature on the kind of the '68, but you see China, Vietnam against the French, and then the Americans, Algeria. Right, it's happening around the world, and then when it gets to the centers, it's also true to Muzdak, like it's true to Iran also, and then it gets to the centers of the industrial world, and nothing happens. And what comes out of that is, I think, a lot of what the kind of, I don't know if Martha Rosler, but her generation is counterculture, which is, it's not the beginning of anything, it's the end, if anything. But again, we kind of. We were born into this kind of the individual artist and the gesture is supposed to save us. No, it's not about individuals. It's about organizing. It's a different project. Yeah, and the infrastructure doesn't exist. That's but you have something totally different you want to say, right?
The infrastructure doesn't go in the street.
I wanted just to quote this famous book title by Fred Turner, From Counterculture to Cyberculture.
Yeah.
So it led to something for sure. It led to the actual artifice that we made as a basis of this discussion.
I would say from hobbyists to neo-Nazis. You know what I mean? Like from that kind of culture of, homebrew computing to homebrew fascism on the 4chan. That's also the history of the digital.
Not the only history.
Yes. Also,
but it is definitely a history. But also that, I mean, that's something that I'm super interested in. But now I'm actually bringing it more to the question of digital cultures in general. Maybe we shouldn't go there. But the fact that this story is often told from counterculture to cyberculture, but also actually it's exactly the same point you already made about the Soviet cyberneticians and the possible alternative development contingent with what actually happened. That it could have been maybe realized in another way. I don't mean this in the naive way. Another world is kind of possible, but there were always alternative trajectories also in the kind of digital network infrastructure AI that we will be discussing. And I find it super fascinating to find this kind of, in computer language you also call this kind of forks. How could you have forked this differently?
So this the daily newspaper of MIT, the students' newspaper Tech, it's all online, and I was researching this for something I did, and yeah, they had sit-ins in one was like kind of basically a CIA-run program for like intervening in other regimes, like a foreign kind of. It still exists, this institution to this day, and I saw a kind of a panel discussion with Salim Tamari about Palestine when it was 70 years to the State of Israel. So that institution still exists, which is all about American foreign policy. And they had sit-ins, and Chomsky was still, a fresh, like a very kind of like a young professor, and he was one of 4 who called for exactly in the kind of labs to have like a day of no research, to kind of they couldn't have a strike, but it was some kind of that kind of thing. March 69, like they had all these things because they realized that they are working for the war system, and the ARPANET was developing and all those things, and they were kind of, that was what, I mean, there is literature about this, right? How is it called?
Paraculture, no?
Yeah, and the one about the Silicon Valley has another name, like kind of playing on Silicon Valley, the name of the book. Anyway, this kind of idea that there was resistance and understanding where this system is going from the beginning by some.
And sometimes the integration of that resistance as
Yeah,
even conscious kind of cultural, alternative cultural diplomacy. Let's tolerate these people, let's actually amplify them.
Yeah.
Which is also interesting. Counter.
Earlier
Countering the counter.
we've been talking about the kind of return of the repress, when an artificial environment is aimed to be or to have a specific direction, and the kind of return of the repress, which is like happening or can happen. And earlier we were talking about this Godard film and about fiction. It led me to think about this event that happened in the UFA, the studio in Germany. So during the rise of National Socialism, and so that it was a studio of the UFA, and Lubitsch was filming, so was defining a frame of artificiality, a film about Anne Boleyn, and at some point in the film there was supposed to be a kind of upheaval, a revolution. So they they give sandwiches to workers, unemployed people, to like wear costumes and act the revolution, and so they were like extras, paid sandwich a day to make this demonstration. And at some point, the new director of the UFA, who was from the National Socialist, and who did a lot of promises that were not fulfilled, at some point he came up on the stage with Lubitsch, and so the people were just having their sandwich, and there are like thousands of people. And suddenly they recognized a guy, and a real revolution started. They started like throwing things. So the field of artificiality was completely broken for a kind of return of the repress of these guys, like really acting the revolution, not as extras, but as unemployed workers who were starving. And I think we were like already like wondering about this issue of where artificiality can have spaces where it can break from within,
It's almost like trauma theory too, like the reenactment of the event, in a way, as the artificial that gives rise to the original. Like the original actually happens in the reenactment.
Right, that's also actually true, right? With all these reenactments of the storming of the Winter Palace. But what you're actually saying is that the dream is that reality will penetrate again
through or like disrupt fiction or the artificial, and it fissures it.
Yeah.
And I have no idea if what we see in the film is the real revolution or the fictitious, the artificial revolution.
I mean, most populist, or if you also look at fundamentalist religious movements as well are based on, on a constructed ideal past that never existed. So they're based already on this kind of simulation or this artifice, right? Or actually it's the attempt to call that into reality, actually, because it never existed is also problematic. Now it exists, apparently.
So I have a kind of also an anecdote, and it's, in November 89, now 30 years later, November 89, while the Berlin Wall was falling, the national television in the Soviet Union had these sessions with a hypnotist. That he was supposed to hypnotize the people in the Soviet Union. He was all about healing them and, if you have a problem with your heart, sit next to the TV on this side. But it was a way also of distracting them, from what was going on. And the reading was exactly this, that supposedly real existing socialism was just a dream, maybe a nightmare, but, the idea, the beautiful idea is a dream, unrealistic and so on. And the breaking of the Berlin Wall is like reality penetrating that kind of hallucination, mass hypnosis, all those things. But we are now 30 years later, and there's this term false awakening, like in a Buñuel movie, where you think you wake up, but you're still inside the dream. You have, so I think 89 was this false awakening, but actually you're deeper in the dream, and now you don't have a reference for reality because you think you woke up, but also you don't have a reference for a dream because you woke up from a dream in your dream. So, and this this would be a metaphor for the digital, basically, that this is where you're. So how do you bring reality, the real back, and to think even more like in relation to this. So the kyber, this kind of the Greek word in Alcibiades. So this is like this is my PhD. In Alcibiades A, this conversation, Socrates, Alcibiades, Alcibiades in English, he's asking him about the art of government. That's the conversation. And Alcibiades they use the word kyber, which means steering, like steering a ship. It's like navigation, we call it, navigation. And in Hebrew, the word for a sea captain is kabarnit. It comes from kyber, directly from Greek. So they're talking about this, right, navigation, but as a metaphor for good governance. Now, when we are now here in this kind of false awakening, you can say, navigation is supposed to be so the cyber is this place in which we navigate, but we are governed. It's not that we are governing, but then you have this hero, female captains who are actually taking, Africans into Europe, right? There's like the different women. There's a German captain, so they are doing cyber, like kyber. They're doing navigation as a form of good governance, and this, I think, is one of those moments where you have this penetration of the real into the false awakening. So it could, following.
So you're actually talking about governance now as a non-digital, like.
Well, what would that be? That's like blood and that's like flesh and blood, right? What is supposedly outside that, if anything? I don't know, but I'm just meaning that this direct action that they're doing is like also disrupts the whole system.
I'm thinking, I think this is exactly where I kind of started with, because this is where kind of my thinking in general ends in this question of the governance versus the contingency. Like, do we want to leave something open at the end of this like cybernetic planning? And then now there's like these uprisings everywhere on the planet, and like no one has the language to even describe it, or when we try to describe it, just like pile them together as like, look at the whole planet is like erupting, but there's no specificity to it. I don't know, I'm thinking this sounds like really old school, but what is the revolution actually doing here in terms of the contingency? Like, I feel like even like when I was in Hong Kong this summer, this is my anecdote, but I was really troubled actually in the beginning because I couldn't figure out the coordinates. Like it's such a strange landscape, like political landscape, to try to figure out, what are the dynamics when you're just like transposing something else, onto it. And then you see like people with British flags and like, asking for Trump to, chime in. And you're like, what's going on? But then a friend of mine kept telling me, just like have faith in the contingency of the event. And it's very hard to, embody that.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I'm not sure about the contingency value here when we're talking about
Or how far it can take us
society.
without infrastructure and...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Like,
2011,
should we be
right? 2011
cynical or...
is where you don't have an infrastructure. So, the Muslim Brotherhood has infrastructure. The military has infrastructure in Egypt. So they take over. Yeah.
But then again, I'm thinking maybe this moment, there is something specific to this moment that might go against that logic too. If the scale is so, this vast, and if, there's different types of like interconnectivity that can happen that wasn't part of the scenario before. I don't know, maybe I'm just, naive, but like, again, I don't know what the contingency would play into it. Like, is there a way to think about the contingency of the social events now that's more productive?
What do you think of this, this kind of Foucault writing for Corriere della Sera, from Iran, about the demonstrations in the 70s? And then at the end, when seeing what's going on with Khomeini, he's saying, nevertheless, we should have uprised. We should have revolted. Like, with all that I know now, still, we should have gone.
Yeah, I agree with that, actually.
Yeah, but you see that it relates to what you're saying, basically.
Yeah,
There's no other...
There's no alternative in that moment. There's no fake or original or artificial. It's just you actually reach that moment of, it's actually absolute contingency. There's nothing that is in your hands to decide. Like how it happened with Lebanon, it was just like no one predicted this. There was like no indication that such a thing is going to happen in this state. Like everyone's just like going about their lives, and then it happens within seconds.
Maybe here to bring up some abstract theorization, Karen Barad's idea of interaction and entanglement, where materiality and the action is inescapably already, they even kind of are brought into existence with each other in a way, like there is, it's kind of the quantum idea again, right? Which is maybe a deadlock politically for some, but it's maybe also in other instances something that's very generative.
So it feels like very generative is a good way to end. Yeah.
Now we'll go out from the bunker, see if the world still exists outside.
Yeah. Okay, guys, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And with all the, describing the fact that we're on the platform somewhere, this was also,
YouTube.
No, but I mean, one of the kind of a, once in a lifetime, one of a kind experience for me, to be able to meet all of you together in the same room, that we were able to, that they brought us together. So I want to thank everybody who took part in this, and especially to you guys.
Same.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Lara.
Yes, thanks to Lara,
Yeah.
of course.